Good afternoon, YouTube. Today's video will be about China selling 9.8 million masks to Canada that were not up to standard, Canadian health standards. This behavior has been going on all over the world, essentially from anybody foolish enough to buy N95 masks from China. 600,000 defective masks were sent to the Netherlands, and I believe several 100,000 were sent to, I think almost 1 million masks were sent to Italy and Spain that were also defective, and some of them were actually laced with coronavirus, if you can believe it. But getting back to the Canadians, 9.8 million masks not up to standard. The CBC had a great report on it just a moment ago. I'll play it for you. Thank you for watching.
I'll bring in my colleagues, the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapellas, and the CBC's David Cochrane. May not have very long, depending on how timely the Prime Minister is today, but we are expecting him to talk a little bit about the PPE situation. Vashi.
Yeah, I think this is a highly anticipated update as far as procurement goes, only because we are in the process right now, and what we've been discussing over the past week and a half or so is the reopening of provincial economies. As those economies reopen, there is not only the continued demand in the healthcare system for personal protective equipment, but outside of the healthcare system as well. And there have been issues with procurement so far. For example, with N95 masks, that would be in the healthcare system. We know we haven't reached capacity, that the measures that everyone took worked, and that the hospital capacity wasn't overloaded. But there are problems with procuring masks that are up to Canadian standards, for example, from China. The majority that have arrived, and that's still far short of the majority that were originally ordered, were not up to Canadian standards. Then there's sort of the domestic front, as you mentioned. There's also the provinces' roles. Provinces are procuring a lot of this equipment as well. So it's difficult to get a sense, I think, of where we stand. At least I've found it confusing so far. How do we have enough? How much might we need for the second wave, the potential of a second wave? And what about in the meantime, as economies reopen? What is the sort of overall need? Are we meeting it? What do we need to do so? And as I said, it's the sort of federal component, and it's the provincial component, and then it's also the domestic supply chain, which of course kicked off when the pandemic started as well. The government focused its efforts on the domestic supply chain, ramping it up, trying to be able to meet demand domestically. But I'm not sure where that process stands right now, because it does seem like it's getting certified or making sure they're up to standard. That's a long process. It's not something that happens overnight.
Yeah, no, and if you look at the figures from last week versus this week, I'll just give you a couple of examples where we've seen really no change. So gloves, there hasn't been more. N95 respirators, as you point out, problematic. And the ventilators, although we have heard from Flavio Volpe, who says that those are online to come in the thousands very, very soon. David, you've been talking to people, and I know also about the role the provinces play versus the federal government, and then everybody, you know, who has a business who now wants some of these things, not the medical grade things, but the other things that are there.
Well, a couple of things to keep in mind. The numbers you're going to hear from the Prime Minister it's a minority of the procurement that is happening in this country. In normal non-pandemic times, 100% of this is done by the provinces, with the exception of the emergency national stockpiles that the Public Health Agency maintains. So what the federal government is doing is trying to backstop and supplement that, because obviously the usage rates and the burn rates of the disposable equipment like gloves and masks is just through the roof during this pandemic. So we've seen low numbers of ventilators delivered to the federal government, but it was always going to be May or June before the domestic capacity ramped up to the point. And even companies like Thornhill Medical, which have been tasked to provide some of these, they had told us they were going to deliver their ventilators to Ontario first, because the Ontario government was also a big customer of theirs in this preparation for the pandemic. The other thing on the N95s, there have been problems with quality for the masks that are coming from China. A huge percentage of a federal shipment was found not to be up to first world standards.
9.8 million.
Exactly. So those have been used or are being used in areas that do not require an N95 standard, sort of as a surgical mask replacement or a supplement. But the provinces, it's important to point out, have their own supply lines, largely with 3M in the United States.
Great.
So they have a consistent supply coming in. Now, whether it's enough or a surplus, that's unclear, but there is a steady supply of masks up to the standard they're looking for coming from the United States. This is why that exemption that President Trump granted Canada a month or so back was so critical, because if the N95s from the United States were getting stopped at the Canada-US border, there would be a full-blown PPE crisis in the Canadian health system because of what is happening with the Chinese supply. So right now, N95s seem to be okay, I guess is the phrase that I would use. The concern is if you get into a second wave in the fall, and you get a massive surge coming into your hospitals, then this is where these surplus ventilators may be required, but also where the N95 quality issues from China become an acute problem. Because if you can't rely on the big bulk orders from China, then once you get into a warehouse in Hamilton or Montreal, wherever, and start looking at them, realize they're not up to snuff, that's where you're going to have a real issue. So Medicom is a company that they've tasked to be part of the domestic supply chain. It's an N95 manufacturer, but it's still weeks away, if not a month or more away, from being able to produce N95s at the shop it's setting up in Montreal. They're essentially repatriating a production line, setting up a whole new N95 production line in Canada. That takes time. You got to get all the machinery here and get it going and get everybody trained and get it up and running. So that part of the domestic supply chain is still a ways away, but the good manufacturers to the south in the U.S., they've been a vital part of this, and that's provincial procurement, not federal.
Yes. So you heard it there. There's a lot to unpack in the statements that he just made. So number one is the federal government. You can assume that the federal government is the ones purchasing the masks from China. Useless, by the way. Now, he sugarcoated it a lot by saying, we're making the best of the situation, but we cannot practically use them for protection against coronavirus. Okay. The second thing was the 9.8 million masks that China sold us that were absolutely defective in my estimation, since they cannot be used for practical measures of defense from coronavirus. And then the other thing, this company that's starting up for domestic production, they're extremely late to the party, I would say. And it actually is pathetic that they're starting now to try to meet the demand. So that's not even a viable solution for another month and a half or whatever he estimated. It's probably going to be longer than that. The infrastructure necessary to try to build a company like that overnight is not going to be possible, nor practical, nor will it be up to standard if they're trying to make it a rush job. So the final thing I want to conclude with is that we have to thank the Americans, because if it wasn't for them, and this is not a federal solution, the provinces are the ones that are buying from the states because apparently they have more common sense than the federal government. But thank God Trump put that precedent in so that they could export masks to Canada for our use. Because as you know, anything that you purchase from China, especially the masks, we know it from so many reports from countries that have had the unfortunate experience to purchase from China, they're not going to be up to standards, and they're not going to be delivered in full capacity nor on time, and they'll be useless when they arrive. So thank goodness that Trump set that precedent, because otherwise, well, it all depends on how coronavirus is going to expand in the next phase of opening up our country, let's say, whether or not there'll be a massive spike in coronavirus victims. What can I say? The theme of this video was to criticize the 9.8 million masks that were defective, that were sold to us by China. I also criticized the federal government for being foolish enough to place that order in the first place, and the fact that the order was useless. So that's taxpayer money wasted. But I have to give credit to the United States. The second thing was, have you ever seen an N95 that compared to the 3M respirators so I'll just show you. Here is a 3M respirator, and it's similar to the one that I use for painting cars. As you can see, this mask is very, very airtight. It has adjustable straps and everything, so that it's it's pressed onto your face. It's completely sealed. Those pink plastic barriers, you could say, they actually come off, and they contain within them it's not a paper filter, but it's like a cotton filter, you could say, something like that, on each side. And then these black pieces here are actually another filter that actually filters out carcinogens in paint. That's especially true when you're painting a clear coat, say. There's a lot of carcinogens in that. And I've used them countless times to paint cars and whatnot. So they're extremely safe, and they are necessary for the industry. So this is the type of mask I use. Obviously, everybody knows they're not very cheap. they're like medium expensive. They're about $69 Canadian. So in addition, you have to buy filters for it and replace the filters and so on. But they are one of the safest masks that you can buy. Here's an N95. This mask, in my estimation, is not a perfect solution. It's not optimal, and it's not actually secure. If you look at the way the mask is designed, there's no adjustment. There is an adjustment that goes on the bridge of the nose that you can pinch to make it tighter, but in my estimation, this is not a very safe solution at all. We use it to sort of keep drywall off our faces in the construction industry. But, you know, a lot of contaminants can pass through this mask here in through the side where the face has the curves and whatnot. Like, it doesn't perfectly seal the face. So the N95 is actually a suboptimal solution. It's not perfect. And as we know from the droplets from people that cough that have COVID, it can stay in the air a relatively short period of time, but it does stay. And like, I mean, it doesn't seal your face perfectly. So some of the contamination can actually get past this mask. This little flap here will open when your breath exhales. So that's supposed to keep it sealed while you're inhaling and so on and so forth. But really, it's the air is not being filtered even 70% in my estimation. This will filter your face 100%. Now, I don't endorse 3M and they don't endorse me. I'm just trying to show you what I use. There's even face shields that they build like so. And like, you can't really see that one. But anyhow, I mean, the N95s to me are not even, you know, it's because I've been in the automotive industry and the construction industry. I mean, I know what mask to use for what situation. And if you're talking about a virus, that's what I use. And you need glasses as well, you know, because apparently it can get into your eyes, and that can also infect you. So, this is the optimal solution for me. But the fact that the Trudeau government bought N95s that not only were below standard, below Canadian health standards, but 9.8 million of them, and they have more on the way. This is a 3M mask, so this is probably as good as an N95 will get. But in my estimation, they're not. I don't know whose idea it was. There should have been a modification to make this, say, adjustable more. Because the bands are okay, but like, I mean, this mask is just, it's not adjustable. It's not practical. But we wasted money buying it from the Chinese. They're not reliable. They're not usable. They're just something that we threw money at, and like, of course, it ended in catastrophe. You know, that kind of irresponsibility from the federal government is the norm right now. And I applaud the provinces and President Trump for making that transaction possible, that he was sending, you know, from the United States, 3M usable N95s, I believe. So that we're actually up to health safety standards and whatnot. That's fantastic. And something that I didn't know initially. I knew that the United States is claiming they're exporting millions of masks abroad. So I would like to see the Canadian-US relationship at a much better condition than it is right now, but unfortunately it's impossible because of Trudeau. He seems to want to embrace China in every way. So, but the Americans really, I mean, I talked to my family members about it, and like, I mean, they're not, everybody is desperate to get masks, right? So you have to take note, be careful not to get ones that are built from China. And I'm not saying that as a racial thing. I'm saying they don't build masks up to our safety standards, and it's not a practical solution for you to purchase from China right now, or in the near future, or even the distant future, I would say, because the Americans will cooperate with us. That's the issue. But right now, Canada is sort of possessed by the Chinese government because of that inclination to serve the Chinese government from Trudeau's standpoint. So that's all I have to say about that. I am grateful to the CBC for creating this broadcast. And I mean, it's fantastic that I got this news. The 9.8 million mask is very important, that all Canadians should know. China sold us those garbage pieces of equipment. But for those of you that care to make the investment, that's the mask you should get. I'm not endorsed by 3M, but I mean, I've used it, and it filters out carcinogens in the air. It's perfect. It's 99.7% filtration, I would say, or 100, probably 100. It depends on how tight you make it. But if you make it tight that it seals your whole face, it's perfect. So thank you again for watching, and take good care. Bye-bye.